Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Valeda Fullwood. I'm sure more people will join us, but I'm anxious to make the most of our time together and appreciate your taking time out and joining us for lunch today. This is part of our observance of Black Philanthropy Month. And in Charlotte, we call it hashtag BPM 2021 CLT. Most of you know about Black Philanthropy Month and participated last year. If you're new to it, it is a celebration of Black giving and a year-round social action initiative that features a celebration every August, acknowledging and lifting up Black giving in all its forms. As part of that work, we also advocate and create forums to advance equity. And in fact, this year's theme for Black Philanthropy Month globally is making equity real. If you were part of the summit last year, one of the products was 10 global funding principles, Black funding principles for equity. If you're unfamiliar with that, I'll put it in the chat. You can go check it out. If you're a funder at any level, individual philanthropist or from an institution, I encourage you to become one of our international signatories, agreeing to adopt and institute those 10 principles in your sector. So I am so pleased that today, in part of carrying that theme of making equity real and bringing it home and having some real talk today about making equity real in Charlotte. And I'm so pleased with our esteemed panelists today. And I look forward to introducing them. In fact, I'm gonna make it short and sweet. I'll put their LinkedIn links in the chat. You can check them out and see their biographies and backgrounds there. And I'll start by introducing Anna Barber. Anna is a member of NGAP. Hi, Anna. Anna is a member of our philanthropic collective, NGAP. She's also the president and principal consultant for Barber Associates. She's based in DC, and she was part of that rock star fundraising team that helped raise over $300 million to open the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, the Black Smithsonian, or what some of us call the Blacksonian. So I appreciate Anna for that achievement and for her involvement in our local work here.
Thank you,
Also,
Valeda.
yeah, let me put Anna's LinkedIn there in the chat. I also want to introduce Dr. John Jackson, also a member of NGAP. John is president and CEO of Schott Foundation for Public Education. He's a resident of Charlotte and works on a national and global realm. He also, some of you may be familiar with him and the Schott Foundation specifically. When we hosted Edgar Villanueva 2 years ago, Edgar was on staff at Schott. He's since left Schott, but he remains an advocate in this work, and a proud native of North Carolina. And we're happy to have John, who was formerly Edgar's boss, with us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes. I think, yep, I put that in the chat. And our third panelist today is Sam Smith, who many of you are familiar with. He is with United Way and leads the external partnerships at United Way. He's well known to Black-led, Brown-led nonprofits in Charlotte and helps work to make connections and build capacity. And Sam also is one of our newest members of NGAP. So we're really happy about that achievement. He chose to join us. And last but not least, I want to introduce Tracy Green Washington, who is the moderator for today. Tracy is president of Indigo Innovations Group, which is a consulting firm that works with nonprofits in the philanthropic realm and with foundations on building racial equity, how to become um, anti-racist organizations and the deep work that that requires. She has a rich history in the philanthropic realm as a program officer and brings a wonderful perspective and work in the grassroots realm as well. She also is founder or one of the founders of CoThink, which is a collective giving group or giving circle based out of Asheville. And Tracy also serves as a consultant. Recently, United Way convened a group called the Funder Collaborative for Racial Equity. And it entails half-day meetings for a half a year. So we're about halfway through. Tracy is the lead facilitator and has been guiding us as funders through that work. And I often say, to make equity real in Charlotte, it is a inside and outside game. Not only do funders have to shift and change, but the Black community, people of color, nonprofit leaders really have to engage differently, think differently, and that's part of today's conversation. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Tracy Green Washington.
Thank you, Valeda. Thank you for everyone being here and sharing space with you. I want to also thank NGAP for creating this intentional space and discussion, particularly during Black Philanthropy Month, right? The very title of this conversation, Making Equity Real in Charlotte, number one, to me is a powerful statement. Number two is a proposition of what could be possible. And number three, it really is a call to movement, to activation and action to embrace a more futuristic approach to what we can envision as a new path forward. The title for me also is an invitation into a meaty discussion and conversation about what is required collectively from all of us, everyone that's here, right? To create a clear line of sight about what is needed as we move forward, as well as an invitation that can be both exciting and also create disequilibrium while amplifying some really powerful questions that's important for us to grapple with and that our panelists will grapple with as well. Those questions can include what could be possible, what can we imagine, what is required, right? Collectively, how do we activate our gifts, our time, and our talent, our resources and sight in light of this shared vision as we move forward? So as we move into this courageous conversation today on the specific topic, it's important always for me as a moderator to level set our conversation. So when we're talking about equity in this space and for this time being, I want to make sure we're on the same space, on the same page. When I talk about equity, and I want to use the definition from open resource, right? Excuse me, open source. The proactive strategic approach that accounts for structural differences in opportunities, burdens, and needs in order to advance targeted solutions to fulfill the promise of equity for all, right? What that requires is that it demands that we ask, what are the barriers that exist for some and for others? How do we address it? What are the policies? What are the accountability mechanisms? And what is the necessary culture that we have to create every day in service to it? Equity is about getting to the root of it, right? About focusing on systems and structures. And it's not just enough to have a clear definition about what equity is. We have to understand that we have to embrace the equity lens. And when I'm talking about an equity lens, I'm talking about the acknowledgement of structures and power relationships, of analyzing the cumulative impacts, of really talking about structural interruptions and innovations, right? And then it's not just enough for us to have an equity lens. You have to understand and lean into an equity posture. And you're probably asking yourself, what does that mean, right? So this posture is about activation, not being static. It's about you being intentional about how you talk about power, how you share, wield, transfer to one another, right? It's about the mental models, the stories, the narratives, the biases that we carry that we have to interrupt every day. It's about the policies and practices, and it's about the choice points, the choices that we have to make every day. I'm excited to share that I'm excited to hear from the panel because this is a panel of leaders that are grappling with this work, that are demonstrating these practices in their work and in their walk every day. And they're going to share some critical insights for us. I'm so excited to hear what Anna has to say, what John has to say, and what Sam has to say. And so given that introduction and given that spirit that we're moving into this conversation, I want to start with you, Anna, if that's okay. Because given your experience and expertise in fundraising and development, what does it really mean for you to make equity real? And what does it mean to make it real in Charlotte?
So thank you so much, Tracy and Valeda and Gap and Share Charlotte. So equity in funding to me is the practice of distributing philanthropic resources more equitably amongst all types of organizations from different ethnicities, racial compositions, and backgrounds. And really being able to trust that the organizations that are doing work on the ground have the ability to deliver on their plans and action, and that they can be funded at the same levels. Black and Brown organizations can be funded at the same levels as other entities and institutions outside of Black and Brown organizations. So I will say that I do come at this conversation from a slightly different perspective because I've never worked on the funder side of things. I've always worked as a fundraiser or as a consultant working with nonprofit organizations, helping to increase their fundraising or to help build their fundraising infrastructure to attract larger level gifts. And so I feel that racial equity in funding, we're at a wonderful tipping point here, and there's great opportunities for Black and Brown organizations to really begin to harness significant philanthropic resources for their organizations and their work, because there's a lot of conversation on the funder side of things, whether it be individuals, foundations, or corporations, about how they may be able to diversify their portfolios. And so with that conversation currently underway, we as organizations, Black and Brown organizations, have a responsibility to ensure that we can clearly communicate our very specific aspirational vision, goals, and needs to these funders so that they can trust in the work of the organizations and receive the information and the strategies and plans in the same way that they would receive them from others. Historically, Black and Brown people have been excluded from both the fundraising and development professions. So I think that this is something that we are going to have to kind of educate ourselves on and learn as we go through this process as organizations. But you're already doing wonderful work on the ground. You have a pulse on your respective communities. You know how your work impacts the communities. And with a very strategic plan, aspirational vision, you can begin to think about how exponentially more funding would elevate and enhance your work. So at the end of the day, my kind of conclusion point here is, it is both the funders' responsibility and the grantees' responsibility to prepare themselves to receive this funding. And so, we work with organizations in getting prepared to communicate with funders. And so I'll address that a little bit more deeply as the conversation progresses.
Thank you, Anna. You pulled out some really important nuggets in there. And so thank you for that. I'd love to turn it over to John to give your perspective as a national funder that's centering this issue. What does it mean to make equity real, and what does it mean to make it real in the context of Charlotte?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question, Valeda. Thank you, NGAP. It's great to have this opportunity to have a conversation. I guess where I start is what I often try to remind everyone who approaches this space, that regardless of race or ethnicity, we're 99.6% the same biologically. There are more genes to explain the variance in our eye color than our racial or ethnic differences. So to the degree that we're 99.6% the same, any variance that we're able to identify by race or ethnicity, whether it's in education, access to healthcare, is not caused by our racial or ethnic differences, but the social policies and social practices which lead to these differences. So equity, to me, using an equity lens, is a lens which we enter the space seeking to identify those policies and practices which are creating disparate outcomes, and using our funding capacity to begin to address them. And I believe that if we are driven towards achieving those equitable outcomes, it is also going to force us to achieve equity in funding. Because in order to step into that space, number one, we know that philanthropy often works off of relationships. You have to begin to develop the relationships with the individuals who are closest to the challenges and closest to the solutions to begin to achieve some level of equity. So equity, using an equity lens, also brings some level of equity, or should bring some level of equity in funding. But it's really, focused on what are those policies? What are those practices? Why are we able to tell by race or ethnicity who's more likely to drop out? Who's more likely to be suspended or expelled? Who's less likely to graduate? What are those policies and practices? And how do we use our funding in such a way to resource the organizations, the individuals, the communities to address those disparities to create equitable outcomes?
Thank you for that, John. It's so interesting what you said, and also what Anna said around these notions of talking about renegotiating, right? It seems like that's a thread, renegotiating the relationship, renegotiating the discussion. Anna, renegotiating what is actually required to do this type of in-depth complex work, right? I'd love to hear from you, Sam, in terms of your perspective about what does it mean to make equity real? And in particular, what does it mean to make it real here in Charlotte?
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. And again, thank you to Share and NGAP for this opportunity to be a part of this panel today. I think a lot of the things that Anna and John have already said, I don't necessarily want to repeat it. But also from a funder perspective, I want to say just a few things. The first thing I want to just start off by saying, and this is more of a cliche word we hear a lot, is the word of being bold. I think oftentimes we are afraid to be bold because we don't know if we'll be accepted in a space if we are bold and say, this is the vision, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to support. I reference this study a lot because it's the most recent study, and I know Valeda and NGAP is working on one that is more relational here to Charlotte with the BOLD project research that they're doing. But there's a study out there by Echo and Green that said when they looked at all of the agencies that they fund or that they're working with, there's a $20 million gap between the white-led organizations, grassroots nonprofits, and Black-led grassroots nonprofits. So I want that to marinate for a minute. There's a $20 million gap. That means we have a major issue in this community, in this country, when it comes to how do we look at things from an equitable lens. So that's why I say you have to be bold. You have to create a system of change and don't be afraid of that system of change. And you have to be able to allow other partners who are interested in the space to be a part of that conversation when it specifically speaks to that system of change. And the last one I would say is you have to be inclusive at all levels. Prior to coming to the United Way and working with the Unite Charlotte program, for several years, we were funding the same agencies over and over through the Unite Charlotte program. One of the things that we have done over the last couple of years is build this ecosystem now where we are looking at it from an equitable lens. How do we bring in new innovative grassroots agencies into this community, not only fund these agencies, but provide capacity building opportunity for them to expand and grow their network and be able to compete for those bigger dollar grants in this community. So again, I didn't want to repeat everything John and Anna said because I think they positioned it very well, but that's what I want to add to that.
Sam, I thought it was a great segue and a great weaving of the pieces together, because even starting with the notion of bold, it raises the question for all of us to grapple with around risk and redefining even what is risky. That risk could actually be innovation, right? It could be these other things, right? And I love that you talked about this piece around gap opportunities. And I think that's one of the things that we all have to kind of wrestle with. Like the gap could be the things that we identify, but what you named, Sam, and what Anna named and what John named are the opportunities within in that, and the opportunities to see differently. In my consulting practice, I always say that my job is to help folks see differently, or to be able to see it clearly. Because if you can see it, you can name it. And if you can name it, you can interrupt it and reimagine it. And I feel like the proposition that all of y'all are offering up is a way for us to see it differently. And so in thinking about seeing it differently, I'm curious from all of y'all, and probably want to start with you, John. When you think about having an equity posture and an equity lens, what is the type of trust, accountability that is required to be able to have that posture and have those in real relationships that really move this type of agenda?
Well, I think, it starts with the level of trust that just trust in humanity and our collective sense of humanity, that we are seeking a common goal. A colleague of mine often said that racism is nothing but institutionalized lovelessness. And when you think about it, our goal is, how do we then concretize or create loving systems? We all want young people to grow up and individuals to exist in loving systems. So to the degree that there are policies or systemic racism, which creates disruptions in loving systems or outcomes that create some level or sense of love for everyone, I think that we share a common goal in wanting to remove those policies and practices. In Charlotte, we have disparities in access to healthy food, access to affordable housing. In Charlotte, we have disparities as it relates to graduation rates and all the rest. These are a part of a system that we believe collectively that every young person, every individual should be able to access and have, great opportunities in across the board. So some level of collective vision or collective purpose, I think we have to trust and start with that. Secondly, I would say that we have to trust, again, the thought leadership and the intellectual equity that those within community bring to solving many of these challenges. Often, we will create some challenges and then say it's up to us to totally solve challenges that we don't totally understand. And I think we've got to pull from the intellectual equity that exists within community, trust because they live in community, they live with many of these challenges, that they also have many of the solutions that we could sort of draw from and help elevate in order to expedite the process of creating some level of equity. And then trust the organizations and individuals with the resources that are necessary in order to do it. And what I mean by that is we can do a better job of giving BIPOC-led organizations unrestricted dollars. We can do a better job of not expecting that they're going to solve structural challenges or systemic challenges within a grant cycle. So multi-year funding with the expectation that we are going to continue the funding until we see the outcomes that are desired, the equity outcomes. So those are, trusting that there's a collective vision, trusting that there's intellectual equity within community, and then trusting the entities and organizations who are closest to the challenge with the resources needed to solve them.
Thank you for that, John. And I think it was one more piece that came through in your comments was that this is a collective responsibility too. And that as we invite folks in this space to be partners, we collectively have to see it as our collective responsibility and not one organization's responsibility, which I think is so powerful. Right. And I'd love to hear what you think about that in terms of what trust and accountability is required. And even moving into John's point, what capital is required, right?
Sure. And I think John summed it up really, really nicely. I would say first and foremost to funders specifically, that not to look at racial equity funding specifically from a racial equity lens all the time, but looking at it as a service, like a service provider funding model. So there are Black and Brown organizations that are working in multiple different industries, that are working in health, education, arts and culture, housing. And so if we are able to open our minds and our hearts up to people that don't necessarily look like us all the time, we have an opportunity to see communities that are doing critical work within their respective communities, and really taking the time to get to know the individuals that are leading the organizations, and getting to know that the work of the organizations that they're doing. Because in many instances, there's a lot of work that's already being undertaken that would satisfy some of the needs of the funder population. And the objectives of the funder population. So while, if they're looking to solve, health disparity initiatives, there are multiple Black and Brown organizations that are working within health disparity. If they're looking to solve educational disparity issues, there are multiple Black and Brown organizations that are working in the educational space. And so not just looking at this from like a racial lens all the time, but really looking at who is having the impact within the communities that they are seeking to see transformative change in. So really looking at things a bit differently from the funder side of things. And then from the organizational and the nonprofit side of things, I think it's our responsibility as organizations and nonprofits to ensure we are preparing, planning, and articulating very clear cases for support and strategies so that we can communicate the work of our organizations in a way that makes sense to the funder audience. And, as Sam said earlier as well, talking about, really thinking bigger about what the possibilities are, I continuously advise clients around, setting up a strategic plan, setting forth a case for support. But then once you've, set your big, kind of fundraising goal, making sure you're actually asking for the amount of money you need to fund the programs that you're working on. I have consistently seen from organizations asking for far less funding than they actually need to fulfill the work that they're doing. So let's not be afraid to put those 6-figure asks on the table. Let's not be afraid to put those 7-figure asks on the table. And for those Black and Brown organizations that are large, let's start getting more common asks at the 8-figure level, at the 9-figure level, which is not a customary kind of like ask from Black and Brown organizations. So planning and preparedness allows organizations to really make those big asks.
I love that, Anna. I love the idea of the big ask and asking for what you really need. And I think historically, that hasn't been a level of comfort for a lot of organizations to kind of lean into and be able to say specifically, it really will require this big number to be able to do it. And I'm just going to pull out some of the things that you talked about, taking more of this ecosystem approach, right, to our work of looking across sectors and working across silos to really have this collective impact and collective vision of what this work could be. And you also talked about the shift in mental models, right? The stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that are really merging in our organizations. And I think the last thing that I think is really meaty for folks to hang on to is your call to action around what does it mean to be a champion in this work? What does it mean to be an equity champion in this work? And how are you going to deploy resources and your capital in service to it? So thank you for that. Sam, you're up. I'm curious for you, like, yes. What is trust and accountability is required, like, to do this work?
Yeah, I just want to start by just saying, Anna made a good point that I was over here just smiling and excited about, because when I meet with these grassroots agencies, I oftentimes find myself telling them, don't be afraid to ask me. If your ask is $50,000, ask me for $50,000, and let me tell you, I can only give you 5,000. But don't be afraid to ask for $50,000, because if you only ask for $5,000, that's exactly what I'm going to get you or less. So I think that's a great point Anna brought up, because oftentimes, especially Black and Brown-led organizations, because of the systematic barriers that have been built, we oftentimes find ourselves always want to minimize our work, want to minimize the vision, and always want to minimize what we believe the dollar amount should be. And we need to get out of that mindset. So just a couple of things I'll highlight just very quickly. I was trying to jot them down so I don't forget. On a global perspective, globally looking at this, I think when I think trust and accountability, I think we need to have more people with lived experiences when we are looking at policies, outside of just being a funder. When we are looking at policies that impact the work of these grassroots agencies or Black or Brown-led agencies, we need to have more people with lived experience there. Oftentimes we find these people who may not have had that type of experience making decisions for our community that systematically keep holding us back. So I think having someone with lived experience as part of that process, and we're looking at it from a global perspective, policies will be one of the things I'll highlight. The other thing is, when I'm thinking, again, trust and accountability, as a funder, we have been very intentional, but I just want to put it out there in the space. We need to have more people with lived experience in the decision-making process. Oftentimes, we go out, we source, we identify grassroots, or we identify agencies, Black and Brown agencies, period. And again, as a funder, we find ourselves making the decisions for those communities or for those nonprofits. I think we need to start being more intentional about trusting people who live experience to help direct the conversation, direct our thought frame, so we are able to continue to support organizations that are led by people of color. Other thing I would say is we have to see more of our grantees as partners. Oftentimes we look at it's very transactional if you think about it. And again, I'm speaking from a funder perspective. We need to start looking at grantees as partners in this space. And I think once we start looking at grantees as partners in this space, we will have more trust and accountability amongst the shared work that we are doing. A couple other points. Unrestricted capital. We oftentimes hold them. We say we're going to give you 5,000, but you can only buy these amount of books at the 5,000. I think we need to start looking at it from a different perspective. We're going to give you 5,000, but here, use this $5,000 to pay the light bill, because we know you need operation to operate. Use this $5,000 to bring a consultant in to help you build your evaluation framework, to help you build your record keeping framework. I think unrestricted funding needs to be a part of it when we're talking about trust and accountability. We also need to encourage more collaboration amongst the nonprofits. Oftentimes, everyone is in this silo. This is what I do. This is my area. Don't bother me. Don't talk to me. Don't come in my space. Right? We need to start as funders or as leaders in this space, encouraging more collaboration amongst the nonprofits, so we can see the work to expand a little bit more than just that specific silo or that specific focus. And then the last thing I would say is we need to be more intentional about taking feedback from our nonprofits. Oftentimes, again, we make the decision. We don't want to hear what they have to say. But I think taking feedback from them, listening to their perspective, truly listening to their needs will really help us as funders when we're thinking about accountability and trust in this space.
Well, Sam,
I
you
can
said
keep going,
so.
Tracy, but I'm going to stop there.
Look, let me tell you, that was so meaty. It had so many layers to it, so many beautiful layers to kind of jolt us in this space and thinking about what could be possible, to the point that John made earlier about what is our vision, what is our desired state. And I love that you talked about the fact that this work can't be transactional. It's relational, and in order for it to be transformational, we have to move in a different way. We have to negotiate in a different way. We have to be with each other in a different way. I love that you talked about general operating support, unrestricted resources to be able to do this work. And what does it mean to be able to do this work? And I also will add one more piece in there, to renegotiate what we think success looks like as well, right? So we have a couple of minutes. I want to give the folks out and that's a part of the conversation an opportunity to lift up any questions that they have. But I do have two final questions, and y'all can choose, starting with you, Sam, where you want to go. What do you think an equity lens and posture would enable Charlotte to do differently that it can't do now? And any final nuggets of wisdom you'd like to share?
I think it would enable Charlotte to be more, going back to my word, bold and more intentional in this space, in this work, in this equity space. I was on a call yesterday with Charles and a couple other Black leaders in the community. And one thing I share with them is that right now, equity is a hot topic, specifically here in Charlotte. After the Keith Lamont Scott shooting, we leaned into it. The Opportunity Task Force report came out. The George Floyd really just peeled the onion, peeled everything off. But right now, it's a hot topic. And what I'm afraid of is that in 5 years, we won't be talking about this equity. We won't be having these equity conversations. You won't have organizations and funders being more intentional about supporting Black and Brown-led organizations. So what I want to say to the grantees and those that are on the call, you have to keep this conversation alive. You have to keep this equity conversation alive, and we cannot allow it to die down in 5 years, because if that dies down, the funding is going to dry up. So we need to hold our elected officials on the civic side responsible. All of you need to hold us as funders responsible, because if you don't hold us responsible, we tend to pivot a lot. So if you don't hold us responsible to what we say we want to do in this community, which is be equitable, look at it from a racial equity lens, if you're not holding us responsible to that, we will quickly pivot and jump on the next hot thing. So hold us responsible is what I will leave with the group.
Oh, thank you for that, Sam. And both John and Anna, just in the next 2 minutes, what do you think this equity lens would enable Charlotte to do differently, or just a nugget of wisdom that you want to leave the group with?
So I will, I'll start, since I'm not in Charlotte, and John can address kind of the Charlotte community specifically. But I just want to say that there is a ton of philanthropic resources out there and available for organizations to tap into. Every year, there's a report called Giving USA that's produced on an annual basis that looks at the last year in philanthropy. And the 2020 report was just published recently. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to see it or read it or even know about it, in 2020, $471 billion was committed to nonprofit organizations across the country. So, I want that to sink in just a bit, because that's a huge amount of resources that are going into the philanthropic space, into the nonprofit space. There are about 137 1,370 nonprofit. Oh Lord, I'm so sorry. 1,370,000 nonprofits in the United States.
It's a lot.
There's a lot of nonprofits in the United States. There are a lot of nonprofits in the United States. And so we're competing for that 471 billion, which I actually think can be improved on, because it's only about 2.2% of GDP in this country. But organizations really need to make sure that in order to compete for that $471 billion, that they are planning their strategy, their aspirational vision, their goals, their needs, and they have a comprehensive 3 to 5 year strategy with budgets built out around where their organization is going into the future. Funders are expecting to hear that kind of information from grantees and nonprofit organizations. And so I really encourage all organizations to really think about the best practices when it comes to fundraising and development, and build out your aspirational vision, build out your goals, build out your needs, your case for support, your stewardship, and then identify the funders that align with where you're going as an organization. I heard a quote recently that is kind of resonates with this conversation right now. But if you don't plan, you will be planned. And so it's important for organizations to ensure that they are planning for the future, asking for what they need to do their work into the future. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, we will have a really nice symbiotic relationship between funder and grantee in a very equitable way.
Thank you, Anna. And John, you're taking us home. I know we won't have time for questions, but I hope that our panelists will drop their contact information in the chat so people can direct those questions directly to them. But John, you're going to take us home in terms of your final thoughts about this.
Sure, I'll just say start with Charlotte is resource rich. And any organizer will tell you if you're trying to build a movement, it requires giving up some power. Likewise, our goal as funders shouldn't be just continuing the grant making process or increasing it. Yes, we can do that, but we also have to shift the power to the point that Sam raised. 5 years from now, equity may not be at the center of many of these organizations who are leaning forward at this point. We can shift the power by creating participatory grant making funds where the grassroots organizations themselves are making the decisions around the grant making. We can shift the power by creating endowments for many of these organizations, which they are controlling, so that when philanthropy gets fickled 5 years from now, there's still a pool of resources invested in organizations who can do the long-term planning. Charlotte is resource rich. I agree with Sam also on the point that collaboration is important among nonprofits. But often in philanthropy, we require nonprofits to collaborate, and we do a horrible job of collaborating. We work in our silos, we do education, we do healthcare over here, but our young people don't live in silos. They don't live in portfolios. So we've got to find a way as philanthropic organization to do just that, collaborate. How do we pool our resources to build an ecosystem or build the types of loving systems where all students can thrive, where all young people and all families can thrive? And finally, I could say, as much as Charlotte is resource rich in foundations, in philanthropy, our grant making is not going to lead to the equity transformation that we desire. It's only when we leverage our private dollars to get a larger public investment. Over the last couple of years, we've seen the CARE Act come through North Carolina, come through Charlotte, billions of dollars. We see the American Rescue Plan, billions of dollars coming through North Carolina, coming through Charlotte. There's the infrastructure bill, trillions of dollars that will come through many of the states and cities across the country. We have to leverage those dollars and articulate how those dollars should be used to address racial equity, to address equity, to close the gaps, to achieve some level of equitable outcomes. It's only when we do that will Charlotte be resource rich and equity rich.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Anna. It's my hope that equity is so normalized that you don't see it. That it's such a part of the fabric of how we do our work that you don't even see it anymore because it just is. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Charles Thomas to transition us into the next segment. But let's thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much.
Yes. I want to echo thank you to our great panelists. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, John. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, NGAP. Again, I'm Charles Thomas. I'm the Charlotte Program Director for Knight Foundation and a proud member of NGAP since 2011. This has been a wonderful conversation. It reminds me of the convening we held last year where I had the honor of moderating. And it reminds me of when I used to be an executive director at Queen City Forward and thinking about this type of conversation, this kind of panel, these kind of networks did not exist when I was the executive director and Tracy was at Z. Smith Reynolds helping us out. So I would like to, one, just hold up a couple of things that just came out for me, and I'll turn the mic over to Share Charlotte and get the networking going. But I really want to say loving systems. John brought that term to my awareness today, and the fact of, how racism is not that, but I want to hold that loving systems. I want to hold being bold from Sam and I want to hold seeing things differently, and overall talking about how we need to listen more, be relational, collaborate, and leverage private dollars is another piece to shift policy and be willing to take the risks that are necessary. So again, appreciate the conversation. I'm really holding it. It's adding to me and the work that we do at Knight Foundation. I want to make sure that you guys stay in touch with NGAP Charlotte. So I'm going to drop in the chat NGAP Charlotte's Gmail account. Please email us so that you can join our newsletter and stay attuned to all the activities that we have going on in Black Philanthropy Month, as well as what we have going on for the rest of the year, because we've got some new projects that you're going to hear about after August. And then I'm also going to drop a link to our website. And so with that, I'd love to turn it over to Share Charlotte, and let's get the networking going.
Thank you so much, Charles. We so appreciate everyone. This is Melissa Hovey. I'm the marketing director for Share Charlotte. And on behalf of the Share Charlotte team, we are so thrilled. This is truly one of our most favorite things that we get to do is bring these groups together. And so we're just thrilled today. So now we're going to transition to the networking portion of our agenda today. So last night you got an email from Caroline Miller on our team with our digital program that has all the links to get to the different virtual funder networking rooms. It's also put in the chat here. So I just ask you to go grab that as a nonprofit. If you're a funder, go click on your link and get to your room. And as a nonprofit, you get to choose who you want to start with and just start meeting in the room. You just get to hop around. Think of it as just as we were in person. You're just hopping from room to room and meeting people. So it's just a great opportunity to get to meet these wonderful funders, make a connection, and we're excited for all the connections that are made today. So with that, we'll let you go to find your rooms and get started. And we'll be wrapping up. We won't probably come back together. It's really kind of just you're on your own to go move around as you see fit, and then you get on with your day. But we really appreciate you all being here. Thank you so very much. So with that, we're off to our rooms.